Our sermon lesson for this morning comes from the Old Testament book of Exodus, chapter 17, beginning at verse 1. We read, "The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' Moses replied, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?' But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, 'Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?' Then Moses cried out to the Lord, 'What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me.' The Lord answered Moses, 'Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink.' So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" This is God's word. Sometimes you read a story and you think it's about one thing, but it's actually about another. You think you're reading a story about pigs on a farm, but you're actually reading about Stalin and the Russian Revolution. You think you're reading a story about a little girl who stumbles into a magical world through her closet, and you're actually reading a story about the death and the resurrection of Jesus. You think you're reading a story where young kids get drafted into a gladiator-style conflict that the whole country watches, but actually you're reading a story about classism and rebellion and the moral dilemmas of war. Sometimes you read a story and you think you're reading about one thing, but you're actually reading about another. This is one of those stories. Not in the same way as the Hunger Games or Animal Farm or the Chronicles of Narnia, not in the sense that this is a fictional story. This is a story that happened in a real time and a real place with real people, but in the sense that you read this story and certain themes come immediately to the surface. And you think that's what the story is about, but underneath that is a deeper, more universal meaning. And that's what we're going to discover today as we look at this story. We're going to see the themes that immediately rise to the surface, but then we're going to look at the deeper meaning and ask how that meaning applies to our lives. So I guess the question is, what's this story about? If you start at the beginning, it's a story of Moses and the Israelites setting out from the desert of Sin, which is not a pun. This was not some Old Testament Las Vegas. It was no more sinful than any other desert. It's called the Desert of Sin because it was in the Sinai Peninsula and it was near Mount Sinai. So maybe it's the Desert of Sin. I don't know. It doesn't matter. That's not what the sermon is about. But they set out from the Desert of Sin, and it says that they travel from place to place as the Lord commanded. And this is an important point. This is a point that could have been a whole sermon all by itself. The Israelites were traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded, and yet they still found themselves in this place where they had no water. See, I think sometimes we think that if we're doing what the Lord commands, then we're entitled to a life free from trouble. We think that if I am giving my life to God in service to Him, if I'm reading His Word, if I'm coming to church, if I'm giving my money to God and to other people, if I'm doing my best to live according to what God says in His Word, then that should entitle me to a life free from trouble. But that's not what happens in this story. The Israelites do what the Lord commands them, and yet they still find themselves in a place with no water. Which brings us to the second thing we might think this story is about, and that's complaining. They get to this place with no water, and they start to complain, as they always do in the book of Exodus. This is what, when I remember learning this story in Sunday school, this is the lesson I always remember taking from it, that the Israelites complained, and they should have trusted in God because he provided for them. And to be fair, the Israelites did complain. That is a lesson that we can take from this story. That is something that's going on here. And the Israelites had good reason to complain, actually, if you really look at it. Historians estimate that there were 2 million Israelites in this traveling party going through the wilderness of Sinai, and they had no water. If there are 2 million people, that means there are going to be some pregnant mothers, some nursing mothers, some babies, some elderly people, some people who are sick, who are going to be in real trouble if there's no water. Not to mention all of them will be in real trouble pretty soon if there's no water. This is a life or death situation. And so I don't want to discount that as we talk about this. The Israelites certainly had something to be concerned about here. But if you flip back just a couple pages in the book of Exodus, you see that in just a few short months of their recent history, the Israelites had seen plenty to show them that God was taking care of them. Just a few months ago, these Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They were under harsh forced labor by Pharaoh until God sent miraculous plagues onto the people of Egypt and on Pharaoh until Pharaoh let his people go. Then, when Pharaoh changed his mind and decided to chase after those Israelites, God told Moses to hold up his staff, and he parted the Red Sea so the Israelites could walk across on dry ground, and then the seas closed in again, wiping out Pharaoh and his army and eliminating the threat against God's people. 3 days after that, after they had just gotten to the other side of the Red Sea, the Israelites had no water. Sound familiar? They had no water, but they stumbled across this spot where there was some water that was undrinkable. It was too bitter, and so God did a miracle. He had Moses throw a piece of wood in the water, and all of a sudden, the water became drinkable, and everyone had enough. Not long after that, they went out into the wilderness and found that, hey, this barren wilderness doesn't have enough food to support 2 million people. Go figure. And God sends quail and manna into the camp to feed them every single day. In just a few short months, all of this has happened. So why are the Israelites sitting here at Rephidim thinking that God's not with them or that God is not going to provide for them? Why are they so worried? I can't even really ask that question with a straight face because I do the exact same thing every single day. I know what God has done for me in the past, and yet I still get stressed out, and I get anxious about the future, and I complain about what I do have, and I complain about what I don't have. I think we all do this, right? We all complain about the things we do and don't have because, this is the second lesson we learn from this story, complaining and worrying comes from forgetting what God has already done for us. Those are both themes that rise to the surface in this story immediately, and those both could be sermons completely on their own. But as you look at this story, there's a deeper meaning. And to see it, you have to go back to verse 2 of our text. In verse 2, it says, the Israelites quarreled with Moses. If you look at that word quarreled, this is more than arguing. This is more than a verbal dispute about leadership and about the circumstances that Moses has led the people into. The word for quarrel there is actually a legal term. It means to bring charges against. The people are bringing charges against Moses. This word is used of God in other contexts, of God saying, I am the judge, and I am accusing you of wrongdoing. But here, the people are doing the opposite. They are accusing God of wrongdoing. They're putting God on trial. And now you might be thinking, hold up a second. They're not quarreling with God, they're quarreling with Moses. But if you're thinking that, you have to understand what representative ministry is all about. Moses was more than just Israel's leader. He was God's representative to them. He was the one who stood before them on behalf of God. When God wanted to speak to the people, he spoke to them through Moses. When the people wanted to bring a complaint against God, they brought it to Moses. Ministry is standing before the people on behalf of God. And later you see the other side of it. When Moses goes and prays to God on behalf of the people, that's the other side of ministry. It's also standing before God on behalf of the people. So when these people bring charges against Moses, what they're really doing is bringing charges against God. If you want more proof of that, look at the last verse of our text, that Moses calls this place Massah and Meribah. Those are the two verbs that mean to test and to quarrel with, or to put on trial. And the AH ending on the end of both of those words is the name of God. So Moses is saying they tested the Lord and they quarreled with the Lord. By asking, he says, is the Lord among us or not? So while at first this might look like a dispute between the people and Moses about leadership, it's actually a little bit more than that. This is the people putting God on trial. That's what's really going on in this story. It's a story about when God goes on trial. And that's what makes this so universally applicable. Because there is a part of every single human being that wants to put God on trial, that wants to make God answer for the circumstances in our lives and the circumstances in our world. You see this everywhere. You see this everywhere in the world, that people want to put God on trial. That people look out at the circumstances of the world and they say, how could there be a good God in such a wicked world? You see it in the fact that there is an entire field of study called apologetics. That literally means apology is giving a defense of. So there's an entire field of study that's devoted to being God's defense attorney, more or less. You see it in the fact that people are accusing God of wrongdoing and increasingly want nothing to do with him. You see this all over the place in our world, that people want to put God on trial. And you see it in your own heart, too. It's not just out there, it also happens in here. When the circumstances of your life aren't what you think they should be, you want God to answer for that. You say, God, I've been serving you, I've been doing what I should do, and yet, I just got laid off. I'm looking for someone to spend my life with, and I haven't found anyone yet, and I keep praying about it, and there's nothing coming. God, my loved one, you took them home too soon. It's not fair. God, I'm being unfairly judged and wrongly accused, and no one is listening to me. God, I'm just drowning in depression and anxiety. I'm suffocated by this lonely feeling. When is it going to end? God, I deserve better than this. This is the kind of thing that we say. We want to put God on trial. That's the natural inclination of the human heart. And that's what's going on in this story. Look what happens. The people bring this charge against God, and God doesn't have to listen to it. God is the judge of all of the universe. He doesn't have to entertain this, but he does. He tells Moses, all right, they want to put me on trial, then call the elders together. Bring them together up in front of the Israelites, like you would do for a trial, and grab your staff. Excuse me. Grab your staff. The same staff that you used to strike the Nile River and turn it into blood. The same staff that you held out over the Red Sea as it parted so that the Israelites could walk across, and then you held out again to swallow up the Egyptians. The staff that is more than just a symbol of power and authority, the staff that is the symbol of divine judgment. He says, take that staff in front of the elders, and I will stand before the people. I will stand before the people. Our translation says by the rock. It could also say on the rock. The preposition can mean either one. It doesn't matter. But he says, I will stand in front of the people, take that staff, and strike the rock. I will stand on that rock, and when you bring that staff of divine judgment down where I am standing, water will go out of that rock so that the people have something to drink. And so that they know that for whatever reason I led them out here into this place that they have no water, they know that it's not because I don't care about them. It's not because I'm not with them. Once you do this, they will know that not only are their needs being met by me, but I am with them and I am on their side. This is what happens when God goes on trial. Like I said, he didn't have to do this. He didn't have to entertain this motion that's brought against him, but he does. Because he wants us to see exactly how much he cares about them. Paul references this story 1,500 years later in the book of 1 Corinthians. In chapter 10 of his letter, he writes this, saying this about the Israelites. He says, they all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Looking back on this 1,500 years later, Paul sees in this story a shadow of what was to come. He sees in this story a shadow of how God would ultimately save not just the people of Israel, but the whole world. That God would stand before a human court. That God would go on trial and be found guilty and be sentenced to death by that human court. That those human beings would strike God and put him to death. And when they did, streams of living water would flow out of that rock of ages that would satisfy our soul's deepest needs. This is what happens when God goes on trial. God stands in the place that we rightly should be standing in. He takes our accusations. He takes our sin. He takes our shame, and he suffers the punishment that it deserves. And then we get to drink from the soul-refreshing waters that flow out of the rock of ages. This is what this story teaches us, that this is how much God cares about us. And as we close, I think there's some creative storytelling. I think there's some purposeful storytelling that happens in the last verse of our text. If you look at it, this story ends with a question. The question, is the Lord among us or not? I think what the writer wants us to do here is to reflect on that question ourselves. Because many of you are probably wondering this in your own life. And if you're not, you will at some point. Is the Lord with me or not? After seeing how God goes on trial for us, after seeing how God puts up with our lack of gratitude and our lack of trust in him, after seeing how he takes our accusations and our sin and our shame and suffers the punishment for them so that we can be satisfied, so that our soul's deepest needs can be satisfied. After seeing all that God has done for us, I think we have to conclude that for whatever reason God allows suffering in our lives, it can't be that he doesn't care about us. It can't be that he's not with us or that he's not on our side. It must be that even if it's hard to see now, God has some good purpose for what we're going through. It must be, like Paul said earlier, that our suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. Hope in the God who went on trial for us. Hope in the rock of ages who gives us the living water that satisfies our soul's every need. Amen.